Great. So welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn on supply side metrics for publishers. Our presenter today and conversation leader is Ken Brooks. Ken plays many roles. He's with Treadwell Media, Amplify Education. He's chair of our supply chain committee and has been for more than a year. Ken brings a perspective on all of the work that he does that is analytical in nature, but also forward thinking, and I think that you'll hear both in his prepared materials and and any questions you may have for him, a really thoughtful approach to how this industry exists today and where it needs to evolve. But there is a chance to ask questions, add them to the chat as you go. If it occurs to you, we'll be monitoring them. But also after Ken finishes up his prepared remarks, not only will we go to the prepared chat, but we might call on you to either voice your question or provide a little bit more background. Ken, thanks very much for doing this. I know that you have a lot on your plate, especially this time of year, but let's get started.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Brian gave me a nice introduction. I'm going to talk about supply side metrics here. Demand side are equally important, and as a matter of fact, they also are a key driver of supply side. So I'll touch on a few of those as we go along as well. But on the supply side, PP&B, paper, print, and bind, is one of the biggest elements of a publisher's P&L. And when you consider obsolescence and some of the other areas, this whole area, supply side, can end up being one of the most largest and one of the most controllable expenditures. It also drives the largest asset generally on the balance sheet, which is inventory. So today what I'll be doing is I'll be talking about the overall context of supply chain metrics. Then I'll narrow in on the ones that I've seen used in publishing most frequently. Then I'll get into some of the common supply side metrics that I've seen along with pros and cons. And then finally, I'll show some sanitized examples of metrics that I use at Amplify. So jumping to the next page here, the supply chain operating reference model, that's SCORE, does a pretty good job of laying out metrics for supply chain. Now, there are many of these frameworks that I've followed over time. SCORE is one of them. There's a woman, Laura Cesare, also known as the supply chain shaman, who's got a framework that I've also quite a fan of. And Gartner has metrics, and I'm sure there are many more frameworks. But I keep coming back to SCORE. Now, there are 5 dimensions here: reliability, responsiveness, agility, cost, and asset management. What I've shown on the slide are the definitions of each of these, and then what they term are the level 1 strategic metrics. I've looked at most of these over the course of my career at one time or another. Tried implementing like perfect order fulfillment in a couple of places. We're doing it now. But I've learned some lessons along the way. And really what I found is that when you're talking to other executives within your company or other supply chain executives, there are just a few metrics that just keep coming up over and over again. And I'm sure in the questions we'll hear about some other ones that people use, like we'll see what comes up. But what I've done here is I've split these by demand side and supply side. So on the demand side is on the customer order fulfillment. So this would be, where demand is coming from to the publisher. So customer orders, it would be fill rate, OTIF, on time in full, is a big one. This perfect order rate is another one. Oftentimes you're looking at customer fill rate or customer cycle time. Generally, while agility is important, and it's particularly important given the supply chain issues we've had over the course of the past few years, it doesn't tend to be something that people think about quantitatively, although it's clear that you can think about them quantitatively. They also look at fulfillment cost per unit on the demand side. On the supply side, fill rate's important. Again, that's really a demand side metric, but it drives a lot of things like safety stock and responsiveness. You might look at the percentage of SKUs that are on back order. That's one of the things that we look at, is which specific titles are on back order. Vendor lead times is big. Again, I get asked about supply side agility, like, can we handle a reduction in 50% of like paper capacity? Or what happens if this printer goes out of business? I get asked those a lot, but I'm not called on very frequently to quantify how easy it is for us to handle, say, a 30% increase or decrease in volume. Costs, now, we talk about this all the time. We've got unit manufacturing cost, cost of goods sold, obsolescence are all metrics that we talk about frequently. And then inventory investment, and then less frequently, somebody asks about gross margin, return on investment. So those are supply side metrics. So I have here some of the metrics that I've seen, along with the pros and cons, the good and the bad. So rather than reading through these, let me just kind of summarize my thoughts on these. First off, many of these are related to each other, but they're often not treated as though they're relevant. You get asked a lot about obsolescence, but generally that's in the context of PP&B staying the same or inventory levels staying the same. Those kinds of questions end up, to me, confusing what's actionable and what's not, and often they drive the wrong actions. So a focus on reducing inventory can increase PP&B and hurt fill rate. A focus on reducing obsolescence can also increase PP&B and hurt fill rate. A focus on reducing unit manufacturing cost can increase inventory and increase obsolescence. So any one of these measures taken by itself can end up causing a lot of damage to the business. So when I get pressure on any one of these, I go back to the models that underlie them all. And that's primarily driven by how much is purchased and when. This model that I use, and I mean, it's a general inventory management model. It focuses on cash, which does end up taking away much of the confusion. So when you take a look at the actions that you take and the impact on cash, and then on the balance sheet and the P&L, your purchasing decisions end up influencing directly the balance sheet and the P&L. They hit accounts payable, inventory, COGS, PP&B, unit manufacturing costs, and obsolescence directly. And then indirectly, they impact sales through fill rate. They also impact inbound freight spend, storage spend, and scrap costs, presuming that you're able to, or revenue, presuming that you're able to sell your excess stock, which flows through the balance sheet. Many of them do. Many of them just skip the balance sheet and end up in the P&L, revenue, inbound freight, storage, and other income. So essentially, these decisions about print and paper purchases drive all of the rest of this stuff. And if you come back to a cash perspective, you end up optimizing inventory, obsolescence, and PP&B. Of course, there are examples where if you're in an, say, an underfunded company and you really have to focus on your cash expenditures, you can reduce your print runs. It will end up increasing your PP&B, but it will reduce your cash spend in that particular time frame. Okay, so what do I look at? And we'll go through each of these. I look at cost of goods by category, although I'm only going to show aggregate. And in that, I include PP&B, inbound freight, storage and fulfillment, and outbound freight. Again, outbound is more of a demand side, but it's part of what we look at. I look at back orders, both via the on time in full metric, but also in detail. I look at an inventory roll forward that pulls together the starting inventory, any purchases, sales forecasts, and then it projects ending inventory, because that's always a question. And then I have another dashboard that I look at for inventory health, which is the percentage of our ISBNs that are in any particular inventory health category. And I'll go into that. So the first thing that I look at is this cost of goods, including PP&B, inbound freight, storage and fulfillment, and outbound freight. And so what I pretty well look at coming out of the financials every month is, what are my major cost per units spend in each of these categories? And these will vary. They vary up and down based on how accounting is handling the transactions, the mix of the product that's being sold, all kinds of things. But what I'm really looking for is, how am I doing year to date versus what my budget is? And if I've done, say, warehouse consolidation or done other transportation initiatives, am I really seeing those numbers show up in the financials? Because that's, of course, what the CFO and what the business really count on. Now, this is the topic of conversation with my CFO. I really get more pressure to talk about back orders from sales. There was a company I worked at quite a while ago. I won't call it by name, but the director of inventory management was known by the sales department as the director of sales prevention, which wasn't really fair to him. But what he did do was a very good job of balancing fill rate and spend. What I do is I look at the particular titles that are impacted. Now, I took the names out here, but I look at the titles that are impacted, when they're going to be back in stock, the number of accounts that are hit, and the quantity that is being ordered by the particular account. This will be different depending on which industry sector you're in. I also take a look at which accounts are being most hit by the back orders. Because this is what our sales folks really care about. And then we go into being very transparent about the cause of the back orders. For example, we've had stock that was categorized as OSI, out of stock indefinitely, that didn't get retired in our catalog. So we didn't order it, but customers were still ordering it, so they back ordered. We also don't count future orders as back orders. And sometimes we get the forecast wrong under purchase and have to expedite stock in. So again, back orders are really important in our business. Next is this inventory roll forward. This really requires vigilance on the overall dynamics of what's happening with the inventory. So we start with our current inventory. We take out what's allocated to orders either on hand or coming in. We then have like a net available inventory. That's the third bar over. We look at scheduled receipts, projected back orders. Oftentimes this is for NYP titles, what the forecasted demand is going to be, and then we look at the ending inventory. So with this, what we do is we drill into product families or even particular ISBNs to see how they look. By the way, the big change that you're seeing here, we're going from a very high beginning inventory to a very low ending inventory. That's because we have purchased a lot for our summer season when school publishers do most of their shipping. And so as our sales depletes that inventory, we'll end up at the end of the year with a much lower stocking level. And then finally, I look at the overall health of the inventory. So this is really the key dashboard that I look at pretty much daily to make sure that the inventory health is good. And what this does is it looks at the items that we think are overstocked. So this dark blue, which you'll see is DB here, 131 items. The inventory is above the upper threshold with scheduled receipts coming in. So it is very much not where you want to be. Oftentimes this comes from really volatile forecasts. And so what we do in this situation is we look to see if we can cut those incoming receipts. Sometimes they're already bought and they're on their way. We can't do anything about it. But we prefer not to see anything in this dark blue category. Light blue is we're above the upper threshold with no scheduled receipts. And this is a risk of obsolescence. Now, this particular situation happens, I think, to a lot of publishers this last year. From the previous year, they way overbought. And so there's a lot of inventory still in the, still in the warehouse that is waiting to go out. I think we ended up buying, a good multiple of what our annual supply was. And so it's still hanging around. Light red is where we're below our threshold with scheduled receipts. So you could think about this as the order point. So we're below the order point, but we have scheduled receipts coming in. So it's going to be green when that receipt comes in. Dark red is another really a danger point. And these are those situations where we're below the order point, but we don't have any stock on the way. And these are the ones where the inventory team just jumps on it and makes sure that they're addressing that. So the fact that we have 8 dark red here probably means that I just caught this in the middle of a reorder cycle before they purchased. And then the gray and black I use to monitor the errors in our process. So with gray here, we've got an annual forecast of 0. Perhaps there's a forecasting error, and black is a similar sort of thing. Perhaps it's out of stock indefinitely. And the key there is you just got to make sure that they really should be 0. Okay, so that's a really quick tour through supply side metrics and a little bit about what we do about them and what we look at Amplify. So at this point, I'd be delighted to talk any further about any of this if anybody's got any questions.
So maybe start with the Billy Clark was noting in the chat that Director of Sales Prevention is a title that's assigned to a lot of folks who work in operations and publishing.
Yeah.
That it may not be uncommon, but I suggested in the chat that we're here to help. I mean, how do you combat that that mindset when somebody's doing their assigned role? I mean, is it to broaden the conversation? Is it to is there an intervention that you perform?
Normally what I do there is I err on the side of over communication and transparency. So when there's a problem, you have to admit it like right up front, define like how it occurred and how you're going to prevent it. Oftentimes it'll be sales came in with an unanticipated order, a big win. They weren't able to help you out early enough to get the forecast in. And then you just describe what you're going to do about it. So expediting is one of the answers, but transparency is key, and having the opportunity and the channel to talk to the folks that are complaining, often sales, is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and avoiding where you can the siloing of the conversation, so that it's not one side versus another, but really here's how we're measuring success.
Yeah, and you really want to make sure that you've got partnership with sales and also with finance, because you will also get beat up for obsolescence. But in cases that I've looked at this, where I've done the analysis using a newsboy approach, some level of obsolescence is way better than losing sales or forcing a massive amount of expedites. And making that clear so that when the CFO comes and asks, so why is your obsolescence so high? It's like, well, you remember the conversation where we were talking about safety stock and we decided to go conservative, or we decided that we weren't going to risk it. This is the implication of it. I find it really important to head towards an objective way of calculating what purchase quantities are versus making it the art that it really doesn't need to be. You can't make it a science, and then you can tie in all of these factors, all these parameters.
Maybe stick with obsolescence as a topic for a minute. Matthew is asking about, um, how do you define obsolescence, and maybe you could say a bit more about how you manage it.
Yeah, so by the time you get to having obsolescence, it's too late to do anything about it other than try to sell it for as much scrap revenue as you can. It's a byproduct of your early print decision. And so again, there's not a lot you can do about it once you've got it on hand. Generally, what I do is I look at, let's say you've got some amount of inventory. I look at what the forecast is likely going to be for all the different titles, and assuming that we're not ordering anything else, so it's kind of you're just depleting your title or your title list. And finance will have rules about 18-month supply or 24-month supply or whatever it happens to be. But I look at that forecast, and after 24 months, there is some amount of inventory left, and that's what I say is going to be the obsolescence. One key factor here is finance often reports inventory obsolescence as a percentage of inventory, which I don't find very helpful at all. I prefer to look at it as a percentage of purchases or a percentage of sales, because that really reflects the dynamics of what creates the obsolescence to begin with.
When you were showing that measure of inventory health, the image itself suggested a focus on never being out of stock. There was relatively few in the red category. Is that a decision, or is that just the imagery that you were sharing to kind of give people a sense of how you look at this as an overview?
No, I look at it as a policy-driven trade-off. So we're shooting for a particular on-time and full rate, which is a particular fill directly out of stock rate. And you can
Right.
build a formula that tells you what your safety stock needs to be. But because it's not 100%, you're going to end up with out of stocks from time to time. And what I want to make sure is that when we're out of stock, we've got something coming in pretty soon to be able to resolve that back order. So I would look at how long is your back order in place as more important than like what is that number to begin with. I mean, it should probably be pretty high. The fill rate should probably be pretty high, but you can't do it 100% because you'll end up just buying way too much inventory.
Yeah, and I think you also use the proxy that how many different accounts are affected, as well as what the average order per account that's back ordered. So again, a measure of relative impact.
What's interesting is that in the school business, the number of titles per order can be really high. I mean, they can be 1,000 titles on an order. And so if you're looking for an order fill rate up in the high 90s, you're looking at close to 100% fill rate on any particular title, which is just way too much, um, given the inventory and the risk of what happens if you don't deliver. So again, I'm focused on making sure that we can fulfill fairly rapidly if we do go out of stock.
So that's interesting. So any given order that comes in, there's a high chance that at least part of it's not going to be fulfilled immediately.
Yeah, I try to keep that above 85%, and we managed to do that. But again, that's got hundreds of items on an order. So
Yeah.
if it's lower, go ahead.
I was going to say 85% seems pretty high, like a really a good target for that reality.
It is, but when you talk to sales or you talk to anybody who's just reacting to it qualitatively, 85% sounds pretty terrible. But if you're shipping low numbers of titles per number of lines per order, then I would be looking at something considerably higher than 85%. I'd
Yeah.
like to get at some point Chris Olson's on. I'd love to get his perspective on this. He's probably going to tell me how bad we're doing.
No, well,
Yes.
this was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing this the presentation. And I think that obviously I've had all those same conversations that you have, and because I think it's just the nature of our business. But one thing that I would share with everyone is you can get lost in the details and remember who your audience is, because sales is going to drive you so that you have no back orders, and finance is going to be focusing on obsolescence. So they're going to be conflicting with each other. So again, remember who your audience is. And a few years ago during COVID, we had really large back orders like many other people. And last year we had back orders that were historically low. Well, that was probably not so good either, right? We probably had too much inventory, and that's why we were able to keep our back orders so low. So it's really a balance in most of these metrics that you presented.
And Chris, you're a regular with us, but maybe you could just tell people who you're with.
Oh, sure. I work at McGraw-Hill Education.
Thank you. Ken?
Yeah, what I really like to do is, if at all possible, is to have finance and sales talk to each other about this and more facilitate the conversation than be the man in the middle getting my head bounced both directions.
In the chat, Anna's making the observation that that you're familiar with, which is that district-wide orders can clean you out really quickly if you're not careful. And she adds that it's great to get the sale, but it's hard to be fair across clients when you do.
Yeah, well, and in trade, this is the issue with either a large wholesale order or an Amazon order. You have to decide: are we going to partially fulfill that, or are we going to let it wipe us out and back order with other accounts? It's not a great situation.
Bob's asking how you factor or adjust to markets that don't back order. Is it effectively fill or kill, or do you wait until stock is available to order?
So this would be like Barnes and Noble.
Right.
Yeah, what you have to do there is you have to look at where they are going to get that stock from and the relative economics of it, so that you can make a rational decision. It may well be, if they're going to order from a wholesaler, you will get less margin, less net margin on it. So really, that's, to me, you really need to come up with a policy-driven way of making that decision, so that you don't pull out your hair every single time it comes up. Anybody else have any suggestions there?
You talked to. I'll wait.
Yeah, I think, Ken, that's a different market than education. And I think print on demand, really plays a big role there, right? So you don't want to be in a situation where you have a sale of 1,000 units, but you're 5 copies short and you're going to lose the sale. So at that point, you don't care how much the unit cost is for those 5 copies. You'll print them in a manner that will get you those books or those units as quickly as possible.
And that it's not that 1,000 unit per order, but that using the never out of stock programs are also quite interesting. When I've looked at it, of carrying safety stock versus using the digital printing or print on demand to manage those interim periods, it's kind of a wash. So you're better off, I think, having those things set up so you can do the print on demand when you're out of stock.
One thing I was going to ask you, Ken, because you talked a lot about evaluating cash impact, but you also talked a little bit later in your prepared materials about the seasonal sales profile of the work that you manage. How do you balance those two? Because you could conceivably have a huge cash impact and no revenue against it for quite a period of time, particularly if you're building inventory.
You don't have any choice. You don't have any choice. You've got to pre-build because there's no printer in the world that can print fast enough to fulfill the summer demand from school systems. So you've got to make that choice, pre-build the inventory, and then let it go. And then any variations in your forecast, like fulfill those as fast as you can in season. But in season capacity is tough because everybody's doing the same thing.
Right. And so in effect, you're budgeting for a cash deficit for a period of time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like I think most publishers end up having, if you look around the course of the year, they've got various troughs and they've got revolvers to finance that. It's worse in K-12, but everybody's got it. In higher ed, but everybody's got it.
You talked about a model that you use for cost of goods sold that includes PP&B, inbound freight, storage and fulfillment, and outbound freight. Those are numbers that I would highly endorse. Just essentially let's look at the full true cost of goods sold. But I imagine that you've had to do work, if not just in your current role, but at all the roles that you've had where you've studied and tried to implement this. You've had to do work to modify systems to get that data in place. I mean, what does that work look like to get from, one way of thinking about cost of goods sold to a more holistic point of view?
So a few things. First off, getting your print scales so that you're looking at cost of make ready or fixed manufacturing cost versus variable manufacturing cost so that you can see if I order 1,500 units versus 5,000 units versus 20,000 units, knowing what that difference in cost of goods is going to be is really important. Generally for inbound freight, I just use an approximation of here's what our inbound freight has been, here are the number of units that have come in, do the division, put that in as part of the cost of ordering. But the fixed manufacturing cost as part of the cost of ordering is pretty important. And the variable manufacturing cost as your per unit cost is also important. It is really easy to get fooled by 1 unit manufacturing cost. Stick it in that formula, and it will give you the most misleading results you've ever seen. It will tend to have you ordering much more frequently than you really ought to. Again, when I've looked at this from a cash basis, you minimize your cost for, say, 4-color textbooks at 15 to 18 months supply when you buy, which is more, I think, than I would say is prudent, but that's where the economics tell you to buy. I normally cap it at 18 months supply. Be interested to hear what Chris says.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Ken. And again, I think it depends upon your audience, right? And what company from a cash perspective you're at. And during certain times of COVID, I think we all printed to whatever level of press capacity we had. And today we're trying to print to a level that is going to give us the best economic delivery, because there's lots of press capacity, lots of paper out there today. And we don't really need to worry about the constraints that existed before. But when you talk to, say, a private equity person or someone who's not in the business, and say we have 12 or 15 months of inventory, they almost fall off their chair. You know, they're like, wait, 12 or 15 months. How many turns do you get? And we said we have, you know, in the, you know, K-12, we have, you know, 1 turn. Maybe we're really lucky. We get 1.4. So again, it depends upon the audience.
This exact conversation is one I recently had with a finance person, and I went in and proved, here's the economics of what you're going to have in inventory and what your PP&B is going to be. And look, it's your candy store. You can tell me what you want to be, but I can tell you that if you want your inventory low, then your PP&B is going to go up. And just lay it out and like, these are the facts. I'm happy to do whatever you want to do. And again, if you're cash constrained, then you will end up, you know, cutting that, and you will end up with slightly higher PP&B. But that's a constraint of the business that that you need to be working in.
And I think, Ken, what's so important is what's the customer experience, right? So if we're chasing after trying to print 50% of our units during the months of July and August, we're not going to be able to fill at that 85% fill rate. And we're going to have back orders, and we're going to have customers who are really unhappy because school's going to open and we're not going to have books for the kids on the first day of school. So you really have to look at all those metrics and really start to figure out what the correct balance is.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's not so much a lost sale in K-12. It's pretty substantial penalties, like some percentage of the order is a penalty for every day that you're late past the start of school. So it can be pretty extreme.
And it's reputation risk. You know, when you have the local news station talking to irate parent who's saying, I don't understand. My son went to school today and half the kids got their books and the other half, they don't have books. What the heck is going on here? And, you know, the news person is so excited and say, oh, who is the publisher? Right.
That's
And
right.
you hate when they name your company there. So.
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay. Ken Brooks Publishing. So, Ken, there's a question in the chat about addressing warehouse costs versus 18 pieces together.
Sorry, that broke up just as you were asking the question.
Sure. So it's in the chat if you want to take a look, but a question of warehouse costs, you know, and kind of managing that on a per product basis versus making a long-term forecast for how much inventory you're going to put in the warehouse.
Yeah, so this there's a couple of there's several answers for this. There's certainly the cost of financing the inventory, and that's the percentage that you normally would incur. We have a 3PL relationship where we know what the cost per pallet month is. So we can go in and look at what's the average inventory. You know, that's basically half of what we order, and then plus the safety stock. So we can look at the average inventory, figure out what that cost is going to be over the course of the life of the printing. Warehouse cost versus the 18 months forecast. So in that 18 months that I was talking about, okay, that's a little extreme. I would tend to cut that back arbitrarily to say no more than 18 months. And then what that means is if I have an 18-month supply that I'm ordering, that is on average 9 months supply. So it's better than 1 turn a year. But that is tied into that total cost of ownership calculation to figure out what the optimal spend is. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Well, I think you're also dealing with a very specific use case in the presentation.
Oh yeah.
that you've been giving. So,
Yeah,
your advice here would be look at your own use case.
I would, and I would also say don't use like a straight line moving average. So in trade, particularly most books when they come out, they get a big hit at the front and then they trail off over time. So when I'm looking at 18 months supply, I'm not saying take that top level and extend it out. I'm saying add up your months of what your forecast is and like kind of calculate, should I order 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months? And somewhere along that line, you will find the optimal amount to order and do that. Then it's an objective decision and you can have the conversation. Okay, let's cut it back to 7 months instead of 8 or 9. Let's cut it back to 3. And you
Yeah,
can just have that.
I think like you used one example of 18 months, but in some cases, depending upon the title, it may be 3 months.
Yeah,
And in some cases, you may print one once and then you're done. And then there is other cases where you have 18 months. So it really depends upon the title and the marketplace that you're dealing with, as you described.
that's right. Yeah, absolutely right.
This is in a trade sense, and I know you have a little bit of experience on the trade side as well, Ken. Edson's just making the comparison to magazine single copy sales, where the sell-through rates might have been in the 30s. Effectively, you needed to have a magazine out there and visible, or else it wouldn't get bought. And he's asking, does that actually apply equally to trade sales, books in stores? That you have to have extra shelf copies and
Well, what's
it's
interesting, so Tom McCormick, who just recently passed away, was, I think, the creator of the big walls of books out in the marketplace. His his I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to come up with the exact terminology, but his thinking was is stacks of books in front of consumers was the best marketing that you could have. And so he would push it all out there and say, whatever the returns happen to be, we'll take it. But just having them out there is the biggest promotion that, best promotion that money can buy. Um, I don't know that anybody really thinks that anymore, but um, people do think of it that way, or at least he did. And he was very successful. He made St. Martin's Press what it is.
Yeah, and there's certainly plenty of stores, both independent and chain stores, that use the front of store display on tables to kind of make that point. So, one thing I think that does play a role in that part of the marketplace, the single copy and putting it aside, is the growth of online sales. So you were talking about, and I think Anna brought up that if you get a single big order, it can really swamp you. But the reality is that a lot of online orders, particularly when it's smaller quantities or specific books, are downturns and obsolescence because it's closer to the sales are actually closer to actual sales as opposed to ordering for inventory.
That's right. You're not doing the pipeline fill that's going to come back as an avalanche. Your pipeline fill is much smaller than if you were, stocking 5,000 stores.
Agreed. You were looking at the beginning at 5 measures of kind of like supply side metrics, reliability, responsiveness, agility, costs, and asset management efficiency. And then you translated or moved to kind of the publishing version of each of those metrics. Is there a value for supply build or more
I'm sorry that broke
by
up
some
again,
of
and
the theory
I didn't
behind
hear it.
the ideas in talking? Okay. How about now?
I think that'll work. but I didn't hear the
All right.
question.
Well, what I was asking was, so, things like reliability and responsiveness, and then turn those into metrics that make sense for book publishing. I'm wondering how much you think your own experience, having studied supply chain topics at an aggregate level, at a more general level, would be beneficial for folks on this call and elsewhere in the industry.
Chris has been the victim of some of my experimentation on metrics. We tried perfect order. We tried a lot of these at McGraw. I think there's some interest in, I have a hard time splitting up what's of academic interest and practical. So that perfect order rate is something that I think is very interesting. But if you're like your pricing errors and all the other things that go into customer complaints are really low, and it really has to do with how fast do you get the orders out and what's your fill rate, then OTIF is perfectly fine as a measure. On the agility side, the upside flexibility and downside adaptability, those are again interesting, but the business really cares about like just make it happen. And it's more like an academic sort of exercise. You do what you can around risk management by diversifying suppliers, making sure you've got enough capacity, all the things that we know and do every day. So it's more that those measures are more like looking in the rearview mirror, as long as you've got the plans in place to handle the problems that are going to come up. Cost to serve, cash to cash, again, all nice theoretical constructs, but looking at cost per unit, fixed costs, that's really the thing that I've had conversations with CFOs about.
Right. And it feels like there's also there is an opportunity for us as an industry to be better at theory, but it is a very practical business, and I think you're pointing out that you can be really great at theory, but if you don't deliver on practice, you probably don't stay that long.
Yeah, I think it's be an interesting role for BISG to come up with, here are the kinds of metrics that you might want to use in each of these categories.
Right.
And maybe even, I'm not a huge fan of benchmarking because everybody does things differently. But maybe benchmarking, well, actually we do this around best practices versus around the numbers explicitly.
Yeah.
That I think is a real opportunity.
I know your focus today has been largely on what publishers can do, but as you know, we've spent a lot of time thinking about the engagement between publishers and manufacturers. We had a session on it just last month. Are there things that you've talked about today that you think folks who are manufacturers in the audience should be thinking about? Because clearly the interactive focus on PP&B is a lot of what you're recommending people be aware of. What can printers be thinking about to either foster this thinking among their clients or to potentially change some of what they do to become better at serving the needs of an inventory-driven industry?
So I've got a few like really fast answers to that because I'm in the midst of these conversations all the time. One of the first things is to have scales orientation. So know your costs well enough that you can provide scales to your customers. So they don't have to do like 50 quotes to figure out like what the optimal print run is. Also get involved with sales and operations planning. So partner with your publisher colleagues to look at what are their forecasts and make suggestions about pulling things ahead or pushing things out. That's another one. And then coming up with some way to reserve capacity, based on the forecast. That's another one that I would say is like top of mind. We've got some other publishers in the audience here. I know Chris is actually, McGraw's probably got the best reputation for working with printers of anybody in the education industry, but I'd be interested to hear what Chris has to say.
Thanks for saying those nice words, Ken. And I agree with the three items that you mentioned, especially price scales. But the one thing that I would add is that our industry is a connected industry, and we can't look at silo operations anymore. We really need to look at a fully integrated supply chain. And then I would take it one step further, and we're really integrated end to end from our product planning to our delivery to our customers. And how that comes back to our suppliers, when we make a commitment to deliver to our customers on July 2nd, and that takes us backwards to when are we going to get our books delivered into our distribution center? When are we going to be able to turn around and ship them to our customers? And when are they going to get delivered? So I think it's extremely important for our supplier community to communicate, on first to deliver on time. And then second, when they're not going to deliver on time, we really need to be, the publishers need to be part of the solution and not just let the printers make a decision by themselves. So for example, we may have 1,000 books that the printer is, producing for us at any given time. And they may make the decision to deliver these 10 books late. Well, they may be the most 10 important books that I have, and I want them delivered on time no matter what happens. So we really need to be part of that solution, because I don't want to disappoint my customers. So I think that's really critical of what we do today and how we look at our business going forward.
That's a really great point. It's a metric that we use, but I didn't actually mention on the inbound side, which is on time in full coming in. Really, really key. And we will end up, unfortunately, still jerking our printers around based on changing priorities. But we're really doing what we can to avoid doing that. It's going to happen, unfortunately. But if everybody's got visibility into the schedule, then we can work with the printer to move, like this title comes up, that title goes out, and help with the scheduling if we have the opportunity.
Yeah, that your observation about the importance of reserving capacity at a printing partnership level plays a role there. I will say that going back to Edson's observation about the magazine business, when I came from magazines after 12 years to book publishing, I was surprised about the absence of scales and that everything was. It's changed a lot in the time since then, but at Time Inc., where I spent my first 12 years, fixed and variable were core components. We would build for each item, and sometimes it was quite cumbersome to reconcile because you're producing in the US at least 9 different printing plants and lots of different binding sites, etc. But it gave us great visibility into marginal and average costs. Ken, one last question for you. Steve was asking if you would be willing to make the slides available. I know you've used some data in it that kind of comes from your own experience. So if you want to think about it.
Oh no, I'm happy to do it. I sanitized the numbers, so they're not the specific numbers that will reflect Amplify. I can't give Chris that much intelligence on operating. I wish he'd give me his numbers like this, but
yeah. Well, maybe we'll make a deal.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it, and also appreciated the time and effort you put into preparing for today. Thanks for the conversation, and we'll be back next month with a different topic.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for the opportunity.
Great job, Ken. This was really helpful.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate your participation.
Bye now.